All right, welcome everybody. This is Julie Kratz, and I have with me co-host of the Inclusion School podcast, Simone Morris. I'm going to say hi, Simone.
Hi, everybody, and welcome.
We're so excited to have you here with us. So we have a bit to celebrate with you. We've completed our season 1 of the Inclusion School podcast, 20 episodes that Simone and I feverishly worked on the beginning half of the year. And as you can imagine, with the current climate around inclusion and especially racial conversations, we especially feel this conversation has always been relevant, but maybe even more relevant today. So we're so excited for everyone to join us. Our purpose is really to help caregivers, educators, and parents navigate sometimes the difficult conversations about diversity, whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, different disabilities. Season 1 covered all different dimensions of diversity. So we're so excited to have you with us and to celebrate. We want to share some of our lessons learned in our journey that we think will help other parents, caregivers, and educators on this topic today. We will also want to hear from you. So we have a huge list of folks that registered today. I think over 100 officially registered. So hopefully we'll have quite a great group in a robust discussion. So Simone and I want to hear from you. At least the last 20 minutes or so will be dedicated to discussion. So be thinking about what are the strange questions your kids ask. This is a judgment-free zone. Simone and I have our Real Talk episodes where we talk about the discomfort around having these conversations with our kiddos. So these things are real. And I know many of you asked about different ages of the conversations. While Simone and I have younger children, 5 and 6, we also interviewed experts that talk to teenagers, that talk to all different ages. So we'll do our best to represent that, but just know that obviously the conversation changes with kids as they get older. We're well aware of that. So this is just, if you haven't visited our website, we just want to do a shout out to all the resources we have available there. Again, we're existing for parents, caregivers, educators interested in diversity and inclusion, but just don't know where to start the conversation. So this all started, Simone and I talked, what was it, a year ago, Simone and I met online, and we were talking and comparing notes about conversations that we're having with adults. And a lot of times we're not as equipped to have these conversations with kids. And I know, Simone, you had some experiences with Millie. I was starting to have some experiences with Jane, and we're like, how do we talk about this? And then we talked to other diversity and inclusion practitioners, and if they're struggling with the conversation, gosh, we knew a lot of parents, caregivers, educators were struggling with the conversation. So we thought, why wait until people are in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to talk about this? Why not talk about it earlier? So the idea was born, and then we quickly assembled some resources and put it together. So Simone, I'll hand it over to you to share your perspective and why we're here today.
Yeah, welcome everybody. So glad that you're here to celebrate with us for this very special moment. I do recall, Julie, meeting you online, and this is the power of networking and relationships. Julie and I have shared interests, and we pretty much do the same things in our careers, which is focused around career expertise as well as inclusion strategy. And we were like, wow, I can't believe we have so much in common. And then we discovered we both had young children, as Julie said, and we immediately liked each other and said, we've got to work together somehow. And Julie's right, Inclusion School was born. And so we're just thrilled that we have made it through the first season, and we are deep into recording the second season, and just seeing how vital this conversation is during this time. Just so important. So we wanted to use the opportunity for today not only to celebrate, but also to learn from one another, because let's face it, we all don't know everything there is to know about the conversation, and our kids will definitely hit us with a fastball. And so this is an opportunity for us to learn in this environment as well.
Yeah, and with that in mind, again, be thinking about your questions, because we learn together. One thing we want to work on for season 2 is fielding questions from parents, educators, caregivers. So real talk. Those have been some of the most popular episodes when Simone and I have talked real about the things our kids say and the things they very much have no filter with this conversation, like in most things in life, which is welcome, but also hard as a parent. That I know for me, I want to do it right, and I want to say the right thing back, and I don't want to confuse them, but there's really no one right way to have this conversation. And so we're going to talk and unpack some of the tools and takeaways that we've learned. So kind of three key things that we want to cover today. Simone and I are going to tag team, just talk about the resources we have. Our guests have been so kind to share web pages, assessments, data, rich, robust resources. When Simone and I first started this, we started looking online for resources, and we stumbled across some really cool things that we'll talk about today. But a lot of it was kind of happenstance, like you had to know where to go. So we've got a fully built resources page with the resources our guests have recommended, and we have some of our guests joining us today that will be sure to give them the opportunity to spotlight some of their work and why they care about this as well. So we have some recommendations to start the diversity and inclusion conversation as far as resources go, and some questions and parenting guides and educator guides, as well as lessons learned. So Simone and I distilled what did we take away from the season, key mantras, key ideas, key questions we can ask our kids. And over again, we heard kind of thematically the same things that we want to share with you. And then by all means, our goal is the last 20, 30 minutes even, I dedicate to Q&A. So bring your fastballs, like someone said, bring the doozies. We are not childhood psychology experts. We are diversity and inclusion experts, mostly with adults. However, we can definitely think about ways and strategies we've heard to engage you in the questions you might be having. So bring those. A bit about me, if you haven't met me yet, my name is Julie Kratz. I'm a speaker, a coach, and an author focused on diversity and inclusion. Up until March, like many people of this year, I was on stages speaking about women's leadership and actually overall diversity and inclusion. A lot of my work focuses on my experiences in corporate America, having been a people leader, teaching people how to lead inclusively in the workplace today. So that threads the needle across gender, race, all dimensions of diversity. But my purpose, and I often share, is my little one, Jane, 6 years old, and I have a little girl on the way, actually in October. So when I think about the world for them, like with gender especially, I know race is even adds another intersectional component to this, but 208 years away from gender equality. And I don't know about you, but that seems like an awfully long time for our daughters to wait for. And that number is far worse for women of color. And so I can't just stand by and let that be okay. I think about her and the work I do, and if we can shorten that, accelerate that, so it's not her great grandchildren that might be equal someday, but that we can all thrive when we're equal. We all benefit. It's not a zero-sum game. We all benefit when we stand in this together. So that's about me and what I do. Simone, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Simone Morris, and I'm a career/inclusion strategist. Most of my work is in the corporate space as well, in terms of teaching organizations to walk the talk when it comes to inclusion. And you're hearing a lot about walking the talk and in support of racial equality right now. And companies are being scrutinized as to the work they're doing to ensure that they measure up and that they're walking the talk. And I think that also applies for individuals because, as Julie said, we each can do something to help create a more equal place for everyone. So I'm an author. You can see on the screen, I've got 3 books. Those are career-focused books. But I'm sure there's a inclusion book coming soon. And Julie and I are also working on a children's book as well. So that's pretty exciting. I have another podcast that focuses on the power of owning your career. But like Julie, my pride and joy is my little girl, Millie, who's 5 years old. And she will be popping in episodes from time to time, and just truly enjoying this journey and getting to know Julie better and learning more about upping the ante in the inclusive leadership space for children.
Cool. Awesome. I know those are the funnest when we have our little ones, Millie and Jane, and we're toying with the idea in season 2 of have interviewing them as they get older. They can talk about this. We have some guests that brought their children on for season 2 already, so it's inspired us to walk the talk. Right? Who knows what they're going to say? It'll be really fun.
Exactly. No
So then,
pressure.
and for them, yeah, exactly. And for them to get to know each other. So we wanted to start first with resources. So Simone is also a graphic designer. One of her other skill sets she has. So she's built these wonderful discussion guides that are available for download on our website. So be sure to check that out. But we wanted to reference this as a tangible way you can continue the conversation with children, whether you're a parent, caregiver, educator, some ideas that we have for parents and caregivers over here that we've assembled from our guests this season. Visit your local library, and even if it's online right now, many libraries are opening up, and you can pick up books, eat or get e-delivery, depending on what's available in your area. Simone and I were pleasantly surprised before all of this happened with COVID, how much we were able to find at our local library. And a lot of our guests were able to find comprehensive resources around diversity and inclusion. And if you don't find what you want at your local library, that is a chance to ask about it. And why don't we have more books featuring diverse characters, for example, or celebrating different cultural celebrations, which is our second point. Black History Month was in February. Simone and I did a few podcast episodes on that, actually, and Martin Luther King Day in January. In the women's history, we have Sally with us today. She talked a lot about how we can celebrate that with our kids. A lot of these things might be celebrated in the workplace, but we found out with our kids, they weren't being celebrated intentionally at the schools, let alone throughout the year is really how they should be celebrated. So these are opportunities to engage in community events, cultural celebrations. Ask your children about the topics, ask educators about what they're doing. I know I asked that question and was surprised that there was no intentional plan for talking about Black History Month, for example. The more parents ask, the more we can facilitate change. Take your kid to an event that celebrates a different culture and talk about their experiences. I live in central Indiana. Simone lives on the East Coast in Connecticut. Different experiences that we have in our communities depending on the ethnic makeup, but you can find so many things online, or better yet, ask somebody that you know that's different or in a different community, hey, I'm interested in taking a kid to different types of events. What do you recommend? You'd be so surprised what's happening right maybe in the next community over to yours, maybe not just downtown in your own community, but in different pockets of your community. And diverse people often know about diverse experiences. Do your homework. So this diversity and inclusion would have happened easily if it was easy to do. It does take some homework. It does take some time. We're seeing that a lot with the racial conversations right now. Reading and getting educated yourself is step one. So spend some time getting up to speed. I think Simone and I have found our Real Talk episodes on the podcast where Simone and I talk about real issues and unpack them based on our D&I lenses and expertise of how to apply these to kids. I think that's where things you can understand, books to read, podcasts to listen to, other experts that we have featured following their work. And if you just small dose it, I mean, we're talking about 20, 30 minutes a week. But being intentional and telling your kids about the books you're reading, the movies you're watching, the documentaries you're interested in. When it's age appropriate, you can bring them into those conversations. I have a friend that's reading White Fragility with her teenage daughter right now, for example. Heavy, heavy topic, but still one that could facilitate a really good conversation with your kiddos. Simone, do you want to cover the other 4 on this one?
Sure. Meet your children where they are. I think that's a great one, and what Julie was just referring to in terms of thinking about the racial strife that's going on right now. I certainly can't download the full I don't even want to say the full Monty. I can't download everything to Millie because she's 5. So I am choosing my words lightly, but still bringing her into the conversation and explaining the importance of the conversation. So just really knowing where your children are. And I have to say, they are super resilient and they will ask questions that you are not ready for. And so you just have to give yourself grace and space and just go with them on that journey, participate in the conversation and don't be afraid to say, I actually don't know. And let me see what I can find out, and let's keep the conversation going. I think that's a great strategy, and that there's nothing wrong with that, but to encourage them to get curious and ask questions and suspend your judgment in that area. Julie mentioned the resource. Am I going over this thing, Julie?
The second half. So the resources page. Yeah, check out the resources page.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm on. Yes, the resources page is a good place to visit. As Julie said, every time we have a guest and they mention a resource, we are dropping it in our resources page. So it's, if you can't take super notes while you're listening to an episode, you can always go to the resource page, which we'll show in just a little bit, and you can download resources to leverage in the conversation. We have found some things like influencers on social media that are really providing a lot of resources, and we try to highlight them. I know Veronica's on the call from season 1, and Veronica, does a great job of sharing in Appleville Books just what they're doing. So we've got those resources tied into our website as well. So just get hungry for the information that's available in terms of inclusion, and you will find things. And if you don't find things, hey, it might be an opportunity for you to create something, because that's what actually happened with Inclusion School and Julie and I. And
Yeah.
Julie has mentioned, go ahead, Julie.
Oh no, yeah, I was just agreeing.
Okay. Yeah. Julie has mentioned before that Pinterest is a great place to find information. It is amazing. Pinterest has a predominantly female audience, but the amount of resources that are on there for diversity and inclusion, and specifically around engaging with children, is just amazing. And so that's an opportunity for you to make it fun, and perhaps create a Pinterest board with your family of the things that are of interest to you, and pick up different things to add to your board. That could be a nice activity to do as a family.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of craft ideas and discussion guides there. There was one about noticing differences and actually helping your kids recognize differences, but then modeling inclusive behavior around differences. That was one of our favorites. We also post regularly on our Instagram, which is where you can find books that we're reading, books by the authors that we have on the podcast as well. So books, we'll talk about books more, but books was the number one recommendation by our guests. If you want to facilitate this conversation, read a book with diverse characters that has a diversity message in it. So we had tons of authors on the podcast. We'll share that list here in a minute. And then just over here on the right side, educators. We interviewed Teaching Tolerance, which provides a plethora of resources to educators, so you don't have to create your own lesson plans. But there's a great way to just think about, as an educator or as a parent that wants to shape the education to be more inclusive for your children, what are we doing to celebrate diversity and inclusion in the classroom? Oftentimes it's not intentional. Every teacher is left to its own devices, which is unfortunate because they have already so much on their plates right now, especially how we finish the year with e-learning, right? And who knows what's going to happen next year. How can parents and caregivers get involved to celebrate this? There's some great ideas around cultural celebrations in the schools, or parents' nights, to unpack some of these things. I know my school participated in that, and I had the opportunity to lead that, and it was a great experience. We had the principal from my school that started a D&I initiative. My daughter's school was our first episode, Miss Lila J, in fact, that talked about that. Professional development offered. We find a lot of educators don't have skills like unconscious bias training or resources available to even understand where to start. So they need tools just like parents and educators, or parents and caregivers do rather. And events. What are we doing for events? We have a lot of motivational events for kids. Are there diverse speakers? I have noticed a trend there. It is not a good one. So pushing on that and asking questions about that. And then things we can do to get it in the curriculum. The earlier we start with this, we know that discrimination goes down with education. So if we start earlier, we can prevent some of the issues that we're seeing now in the media and today in society. This is currently our resources page. So we have all of our guests link to, as well as books and tools that they mention on the podcast. So just wanted to show kind of a snapshot of the plethora of tools that we have available at inclusionschool.com. So be sure to check that out. In addition to that, I know we have some of our guests here on the podcast, perfect timing. Veronica, if you want to come on, Veronica, if you're able to come on live and share some of your thoughts, I know you just chatted a response, but if you want to unmute and share what you just shared,
Yeah,
Veronica Appleton was one of our guests on season 1 as well. Veronica, do you want to introduce yourself?
of course. Hi, ladies. How are you? Simone, Julia, it's always nice to see you. Hi, everybody on the call. That was literally perfect timing and I didn't know it. I shared my website and also my Instagram for those of you that are looking for tips on how to have a conversation with your child or even maybe some of your students about racial equity. I provided 9 tips that you can kind of check out. In addition to that, I also have some downloadable worksheets, and these are just general worksheets to just kind of keep your child's minds going. So if it's crossword puzzles, if it's, reading the book Journey to Appleville, and then also doing some reading comprehension, you can do that as well. So I love not only creating stories that feature diverse characters, but truly educating parents on how to develop a more inclusive space for their children. There's so many moments where, we have these conversations as adults, but, children, their minds are just so rich with information and, they don't know where to go with it. They ask their teachers so many questions and, we can't always count on the teachers to do everything, right? We also have to do our part at home. So I love what I do, and I love that Simone and Julie are really doing some great work. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to just kind of share some snippets of me, and I look forward to hearing from you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be sure to link to that. So everyone will get a copy of the recording. As long as you registered, you'll get a copy of the recording, as well as the resource guides we just shared, as well as what Veronica just shared. Applevillebooks.com is where to go for that. So we'll be sure to link to all this good stuff. And then we also have another guest from season 1, Sally Perkins, on. She's a storytelling expert, reads stories to kids now virtually. I've got to benefit from that. It's been so cool. But she talks a lot about women's suffrage and the women's rights movement and how to make that relevant to kids. As you can imagine, this year is the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, little known fact with everything that's happened this year. Sally's been a bit on the sidelines with that message, but we had a really cool conversation with Sally about how to have that conversation with kiddos, and still very much a conversation we still should be having. Sally, you want to share some thoughts with our group?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. This is just such a fantastic conversation to be part of and so critically important. I do mostly performance work with storytelling, and my suffrage performance is geared toward people who are probably, I would say, 13, 14 and up. So I would not at all consider myself an expert on how to talk about voting rights to children, young children. However, there are a couple of things that are so clear to me about talking about the importance of voting, and especially as it relates to racial equality and gender equality. And I just think there's so much opportunity as we approach election season now for all of us to think about how we wrap our children into our voting experiences. And I remember from the stories of the women who were fighting for our right to vote hundreds of years, or hundreds, 70, many, many years ago, over 100 years ago, when they were fighting for that, they would make arguments. They would have to rebut arguments that they would abandon their children by going to vote, and that this was going to be detrimental to the children when women went to the polls. And of course, we think this is absurd, but it's always brought to my mind when my kids were little, they're older now, but the importance of taking our children with us to vote. And now even more, if we're voting at home, what an opportunity to set our children down beside us as we're filling out a ballot. I mean, it just couldn't be any better than that. And what an opening to a conversation about, I wouldn't have been able to do this, and you would not have been able to do this only a few short years ago. And it can be just a gentle way of opening up that conversation. So lots of rich opportunity at our fingertips, visceral opportunities to engage the voting conversation with kids.
Yeah, I love that. I love, so relevant, Sally, right
In
now.
addition to the great puzzle that everybody should have with their kids. And
Oh,
that's, I see you've got that listed on your screen right there. But this is a
Yep.
great jigsaw puzzle, and it's very inclusive. I love it because it's includes all women of many colors who were part of the fight for the right to vote. So it's a more inclusive version of the story, which is so important.
Yes, 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 absolutely. I love that. Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Sally. And we've got this hyperlinked, all of these tools hyperlinked on our webpage that we'll share with you after this as well. And then one more guest we have from season 1 was Neil Miller. Neil, are you on? Do you want to come on and share a bit about yourself?
Sure. Happy to be on. My work's more in the world of work and office. I interview people to talk about how we can make the future of work better, how we can build more of a digital workplace that's a place that works for everyone. So one thing I try to do is just normalize the conversations around inclusion in lots of different forms to make sure people are aware of it. But I mean, I also have kids too at home, so this is a topic that's near to me, and being upfront with them about these topics, I think is very important. And it's been fun to travel along and to see a lot of these tools that are out there, and just really being honest as I can with my kids to help them understand those things. So I really appreciate all these resources.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And thanks for being on. And I think really including white men in the conversation around diversity and inclusion. So a lot of women we find naturally drawn to our episode. We can see the gender breakdown skews heavily female with our audience. But I think it's awesome that we have a number of men like Neil talking about this with his kids. And in his episode, he shared a story about how he talked about race and our racial history with his kids. And I think we're all learning. We didn't learn the real history in history books, and our kids still aren't. So finding ways that we can educate our kids with having gentle messages about it, but real ones, and really understanding our racial past. So I appreciate Neil's perspective.
And yeah, I have a son and a daughter, so it's interesting to see, like, even now with my eyes more wide open about the differences and how people talk to them and opportunities that are available for them. So trying to walk through that with my eyes wide open there too.
Yeah. Yep, that's all we can do right now. Awesome, Simone. I've been talking too much. Why don't you want to talk about lessons learned, and then we'll get into some Q&A. So be thinking, everybody, about questions. We'll have plenty of time to share after this.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is one of the things that I enjoyed about Neil's episode was just the vulnerability. All the episodes, the vulnerability of our guests, just to share their journey and how they stumbled onto inclusion, is interesting to hear. And that's one of the lessons I've learned on this season, is just everybody's story is so different, yet we all have a passion to create a more inclusive world, and we're doing our best. And so, Julie and I, the episodes that are most listened to actually is the real talk. We go and we look at the stats, and people want to hear the stories and our experiences, and we just honestly talk about it. I think one of the most downloaded ones was the one about Black History Month. And we had a conversation about bringing that into the schools. And I was telling Julie about how I tried to send an index card each day with my daughter to school with a factoid for Black History Month. Actually, I asked the teacher first, what are you doing for Black History Month? And there was crickets, and I was like, okay, here's my opportunity. And so I would say that's one of the pieces of advice that I would give to parents, is to, don't just be satisfied with, well, we're not really doing anything. if that is the case, there's an opportunity for you to do your research and to contribute to the education that your child is getting inside the school and outside the school. So we had a rich conversation about Black History Month and sharing knowledge with our children. And so, like I said, mine started out with the index cards that were going each day. And actually, I went into the school to read a story, and I worked with the library to pick out a book that would be age appropriate to share content. And I actually thought it would be really easy to just grab a book and read. And that was not my experience, because I felt like a failure, because the book, even though I spent time trying to pick out the right book, it had some heavy content in it. And I was uncomfortable as I was reading it to think, okay, what do I say next? So it definitely has been a very good season with lots of lessons on this side, Julie.
Yeah, and it helps me to not feel alone too in talking about issues with race. When I've approached hard conversations with my daughter, and she asked very candid questions about, why did Martin Luther King die? And that was my first moment that I text Simone, like, this is why white people don't talk about this. Like, candidly, I was at a loss of, I don't understand what to reply to her. But what we found is listening to our kids, listening to their curiosity. You don't have to have all the right responses. And Simone coached me through that moment, and realizing my own privilege of not having to have that conversation was really eye-opening for me, because as you compare notes with people of color, that's not a choice that they have. And so honoring that, but also wanting others to learn from that. And Simone, did you want to talk about this a little bit too? Because there is a problem, as we discovered. We've been perusing bookshelves, and we are like ninjas with books, like trying to find the most inclusive books. And this is some data from 2018. And we actually had the Cooperative Children's Center in Wisconsin that measures all this data on the show as well. And it's stark how much there's a problem just in our books on diversity.
I agree. One of my favorite episodes was Madeline Tyner from the Cooperative Exchange, like you mentioned, Julie. And it was so eye-opening. I have a tech background, so data is my jam. And Madeline came with all this data that they review 4,000 books each year. And they literally look through the book for content, and then they gather data. And this is what she provided to us. So if you'll see, of the books reviewed, 27% of them depict animals in, I guess, a diverse sort of way. But if you look at the makeup of how many American Indians are featured in children's books, 1%, Latinx 5%, Asian Pacific Islander 7%, African Americans 10%. And so that totals to about 23% from a diversity standpoint. So that supports the message that we have a hard time finding diverse books. And the conversation continued to include books that are written by people of color, that there is also an opportunity to provide windows and opportunity for people to have different experiences through the books. And so that just got Julie and I going. I just carried on after that episode, and we got ourselves ramped up, and we are writing a children's book together, just because there's a huge opportunity to enter that space. And now I'll pull Veronica in here if she has any thoughts, because she's written children's books as well.
Yeah, Veronica, you want to share any thoughts on this?
Is she on mute?
She might be. Here, maybe we'll message her and pull her in. Another one of our guests, Big Books for Little Hands. And we found each other online, and she does a great job posting on Instagram daily. She talks a lot about this and the diverse representation and some of the language around this. There's actually terminology that Simone and I have learned about windows and mirrors. So we need mirrors as kids to see ourselves reflected in the book, We also need windows into other worlds. So you can imagine how much this is a problem when 50% of characters that kids see from a young age may not look like them. If they identify as a child of color and not seeing themselves reflected at all, especially as the protagonist, it's very rare that there's a non-white protagonist in children's books. So Simone and I did some auditing of our bookshelves, and that's one thing we recommend. Take a look at your bookshelf. And I think what you're going to find is it probably looks like this. And that, not that there's a problem with animals, but when you total this up and it's 23% versus 27%, to me, that seems very sad that kids don't see themselves reflected and animals are out representing themselves in books. So we can do better. There are, I think, 3,500 or so books every year that come out for kids. So there's an opportunity to be better. So Simone and I are working on something. I would say one other thing is when you find a book about diversity, you know, we take pictures of books that we think are really representative often on our Instagram page and Pinterest pages, but in our authors' books. But often it's an overt message around diversity of everybody's, you know, appreciate differences or diversity is a good thing. And I'm not trying to be fickle in how I represent this, but kids aren't going to pick that book off a shelf sometimes. Adults will, right? Because we're like, yay, yes, I want that message for my kid. But a kid wants a book that's interesting, that has a good story. So that's what Simone and I are working on, is a fun story that also happens to teach a lesson. So you get the kids and the parents involved. So kids want to read it and they want to learn, and parents feel good about the message. Overwhelmingly, we heard this: meet children where they're at. So this message is, we could repeat this 1,000 times. How many times do we hear this in season 1, Simone?
A lot.
Right. And this has to do with age appropriateness, like Simone said, with finding the book for Black History Month. It also has to do with the conversation changes as kids get older. One of our new episodes will be coming out soon. Season 2 will be coming out starting July 20th. Talks about teenagers and how to talk to teenagers about this. That was kind of a gap we had in season 1. And another expert shared kind of ages 8 to 10 is a nice sweet spot to really talk more progressively about these topics. So as you have kids at different ages, just the content will change. But no matter what, it takes bravery. I know I've had to really put on my brave face. We had Mike Hess, remember, Simone talked about getting up in front of kids. He got up in front of kids. He's like, I've never been so much more nervous in my life. Talking to adults, you know, Simone and I can do all the time. Yeah, I don't know what it is about kids, but it is terrifying because you just don't know where the conversation's going to go. You don't know. And as adults, we unlearn this curiosity that they naturally have. So Jane's questions I found to be quite direct, and we'll talk candidly about those. Be brave. This is a brave place. You don't have to say and do the right thing. So like Simone said, give yourself grace. Be vulnerable. All of our guests were super vulnerable in sharing their stories of how they got into this work. And a lot of them, they made a mistake. They couldn't find something for their kids. They wanted to be better. We're all doing this the best way we know how. So give yourself permission to be yourself. Give your kids permission to be their bold selves. There's no one right way to do this. And candor, you know, we can't do this in a PC safe way, especially with kiddos. So candor is the only way to talk about this. And we found some phrasing around empathy especially helpful from our guests, saying, I don't know, or I'm so glad you shared this with me, to your kids. You don't have to have the answer on the spot. You can research it later. And again, our website has a lot of tools to research, so you're not alone. Simone, do you want to talk about kind of questions and thoughts to ask, and we'll see if we can get Veronica back.
Sure. Just, you know, asking, digging, unpacking, if you will, to understand the questions that your children are asking you. So get into a place of curiosity as your children start to ask questions. I know my daughter, she's famous for, as soon as I answer one question, there's another question and there's another question. And so I will have thought that I answered it, but obviously not if she continues to ask in service of understanding. So when you're having conversations with your children, you assume the curious hat, if you will, and just get curious with, why are you asking that? You know, what makes you say that, or what makes you think that, or what about that is curious to you? We had a guest talk about watching movies and getting curious about the movies, so you can spot some diversity in movies and then ask your children, what do you think about that? I love what you were saying before, Julie, about reading the book White Fragility and having that as a discussion with an older child and saying, what do you think of this? And by the way, the kids, no matter the age, some of them are driving the conversation. And kudos to them if they're driving the conversation. If they're not, don't remain silent and just be like, I don't have to talk about this. You try to encourage the dialogue to say, hey, what do you think about this? And see where they're at mentally about it. And if you can engage in a conversation, it would be a good thing to do.
Yeah, and I think just asking questions versus having the answers. This is a coaching trick that Simone and I know from our professional experience. And sometimes I forget with kids. Say more. I'm curious. A lot of the questions that Simone mentioned, have those in your back pocket for the conversation. And we find the conversations, although there are multiple questions, like you said, Simone, we're talking about like 5 minutes every once in a while. We're not talking like full-blown debate, hour-long dinner table conversations. As they get older, perhaps. But we're having kind of 5-minute conversations about this. And one of the things I found is just sharing short videos with Jane and talking, like, what'd you think of that? And sometimes she's like, it was cool, and that's it. And other times she asks more in-depth questions. So just meet them where they're at. And then Simone, I know you put this together, the adult work to this, and then we'll be ready for Q&A here shortly. Did you want to speak
Absolutely.
to especially the grace piece?
Yeah, I think the understanding that you don't have to have all the answers, and to just give yourself a break, give yourself some grace that you are being brave, as we talked about before, and you're willing to have this conversation. So be gentle, empathetic with yourself on this journey. Give yourself some grace instead of beating yourself up. Oh my gosh, I did not handle that well. I didn't know the answer. Just, again, as I said earlier in this webinar, that you can stall. You can say, you know what? I don't really know the answer to that. Let me find out, which leads us to the next one. You're going to have to be in a place of continual learning to grow inclusive leadership muscles. So, I like to say, think about the gym. If you're not working out, what happens? What happens to your shape? So the same thing with the inclusive leadership, the inclusion conversation, the inclusion competency. If you're not learning and building skills in that area, then there's a huge opportunity to, so stay in a place of learning. And this next one, speak, it's what I said before. You've got to speak up. If your child is not talking about the conversation, don't assume everything is a-okay. At least bring it into the conversation, be brave and speak up and say, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on, even with COVID. I've had to have conversations with my daughter around what's happening with COVID. What does that really mean? Well, the same thing about racial equality. I've met her where she is as a child about what's happened with George Floyd. So, it's not about just removing it from the equation because she's too young to have a conversation. It's about meeting her where she is with a relevant topic and relevant bites that she can understand, and increasing as she gets older. And of course, celebrate that you are on this inclusion journey. I would say celebrate, find an accountability partner, and work through with them this journey that you're on. What's great about Julie and I is that we can easily text one another or we check in once a week on Mondays and talk about what's happening. But it's nice to have that person to talk about, hey, Jane said this or Millie said this. What do you think? What would you have said? And so you can find some partners like this for this journey, but please celebrate that you are on the journey as well.
Yeah, I know, not feeling alone in this, not feeling like you're the only one wrestling with this really helps. And Simone and I will read books or share videos. A couple that are good that we've shared recently, that Procter & Gamble has done some ones on race before all of this, the look and the talk. The talk, especially if you Google that Procter & Gamble, the talk, really relevant if you haven't seen that piece. That may be something you could talk to your kids about. We talked about it. We read the memo together. that was written more for women of color in the workplace. And Simone and I compared and contrasted, thoughts on that. So it's just nice to have somebody in it with you. All right, so we promised to get to Q&A. So what questions do you have? Fire them away. This is a brave space, just like the bravery we've been talking about for this candid conversation around D&I with kids. Questions your kiddos have been asking. Certainly we know the last 3 weeks have been very tumultuous from a race perspective. So I can imagine many of you are probably wrestling in particular with that. So if that's most relevant, Simone and I can kind of share some ideas and things that we've been doing with our kids over the last few weeks, but by no means do we have all of the answers. We want to hear from you. So what questions do you have? Go ahead and chat them away if you want to get cozy on the chat here. I know we've had some folks chatting, but go ahead and message questions, thoughts you have. I know we packed in a lot today. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, Simone and I just wanted to make sure that we stayed connected after today. So we do have a website and an email address, talktous@inclusionschool.com. We are actively looking for guests for season 2. So we'll start recording again in August for the fall. We have some really cool ones already lined up. Simone and I did a few weeks ago. So excited. Like we've covered the gamut on we talked about pride, we talked about disabilities, we talked about so many different things, teenage journaling, all sorts of cool stuff we're excited about for season 2. So more to come. New episodes come out July 20th. If you've got guest ideas or want to be a guest, we love parents and caregivers, stories and tools that you're using as well. Or any questions that you don't want to share with the group that you want to share privately with us. We'd love to use those as examples also for our Real Talk episodes. So we wouldn't say it was from you unless you wanted us to, but we will certainly use that as input for Real Talks. Danielle, oh, awesome. She has a question. I'm currently expecting my first child. How can I incorporate diversity training early childhood before we have conversations? Yeah, diversity and inclusion, I'd love to say starts in the womb. It is interesting how much, people make questions about gender expecting right now. People are like, what's the gender of the baby? And I like to tease and be like, I don't know. Like, we'll find out someday. The sex is a girl. But I'm just kidding with you there, Danielle. Simone, do you want to kind of give thoughts on this one? Thoughts on early childhood, the earlier? So I'm thinking, when they're a few months old to a few years old before the conversations we're having now.
Well, I'm even thinking back to in the womb, Julie, because I know that some parents, when the child is in the womb, they are being proactive in thinking about daycare or childcare and where your child is going to go. And I remember taking my daughter to a TWOS program where I did not feel so welcomed in that environment. And I had to think about diversity and inclusion a bit. It wasn't a very diverse environment. And so I had to pay attention to what the teachers look like, what the classroom looks like, what they're covering in the curriculum, and, the students in the classroom. So I think as you think about where to enroll your child, there is an element of inclusion in that, because you have to look at the environment and what they're doing. Because if they're not fostering a welcoming environment and inclusion, then that's going to make it harder for your child in the long run. So I think you can look at that. And I think you can do work on yourself as a parent, even while you're pregnant. What is the food that you're eating? Who are you associating with? And there's a variety of things that you can expose yourself to. Books as you prepare for your child, and the books that you have on your library, like we talked about, what are the books that you're getting in? So take a look at what you have, and then there's an opportunity to pick up new books. I would say the children's library is phenomenal for making book recommendations that are age appropriate for your children. So you can go to the library or engage with the librarian and say, I'm expecting what baby books should I include? But you can even look on Amazon and look at diverse categories and pick from that selection as well.
Yeah, those are all great. I love the childcare, being intentional about your choice there. I would say too, Danielle, even when your child's very little, they're taking it all in. Like I was reminded about they're sponging and like seeing what the world is from an early age and what it looks like. And one of the biggest things people said is welcome different types of people into your home, have dinner with different types of people, whether that's different races, different sexual orientations, like just a variety of different types of family structures and guests in your home. And that's something I really strive for early, thinking about who I invited to her birthday parties, for example. Was it all white people? I think that's a problem. So, really thinking about diversifying the experiences, even at a little age, they're starting to make assumptions about the way the world is and how people look. And I know, Simone, you had it. That was one of the things we connected on early, was you had an interesting experience with your child care, a boy saying something to Millie that was not very inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, in the twos program, he said on the playground, "You don't belong here," and I was just floored because it was a twos program, and I just did not expect that to happen at such a young age. So it can happen, and we addressed it by talking to the school leadership, who were overly apologetic, and just, we tried to stay in that environment, but as she got older, we realized that she needed to be in a more diverse environment to thrive. So yeah, absolutely. And back to the party, I remember, I think I told you, Julie, there was this little boy who was not so nice to my daughter in her new school. And I was struggling with whether or not to invite him to the birthday party. And I was troubled because I do inclusive work for a living, and actually having to be intentional about inviting them to the party, even though I was like, I don't want to invite them, but I rose to the occasion and I did invite them. They didn't come, but I did invite them.
Uh, yeah, taking the high ground with that. And at two, like that's a good reminder. At two, he's already learned from probably people he's been around and things he's heard about belonging. And belonging is one of our most deepest needs as humans, and little kids feel that. And if he was able to articulate that at two, it's just even more of a reason to be proactive with these conversations. Don't wait till your kids come to you at age 5. Start early having that conversation. So love all those tips. Susan has a question. Any guidance on how to lead some of these efforts with our kids' schools? Yeah. Parent toolkits, any good models to bring this conversation into classes as a parent volunteer? Maybe a frank question, is it appropriate to lead these efforts when you're not a person of color? Yeah, I'll take that one. And then Simone, you want to think about the other ones too, because teaching tolerance gives a lot of great tools that I don't think a lot of educators are even aware of. But yes, I get that question a lot, not being a person of color. Why are, is it appropriate for you to talk about this? And I've personally challenged myself of, yes, and we need all people talking about this, to put the burden fully on people of color to talk about people of color issues in the workplace or at schools is not fair. It's emotionally taxing, it's exhausting, but not being an expert. So a lot of times I'll partner, like the book we're writing, right? Of Simone's perspective and my perspective, it has to be balanced because own voices is so important. We have our own lens of the world. I can't unsee my white lens on things. So rather, the term I use is I want to be an ally. I strive to be an ally. I'm not claiming to be one. I'm not self-proclaiming to be some sort of white savior, white knight that we know how that feels. That's not helpful. But instead, I really want to be supportive of diversity and inclusion. And I've found that to be extremely welcomed by my school's D&I committee in their leadership, their principals, and their staff. So a lot of it's just how you frame it, how you approach it, but absolutely valid question. Simone, other thoughts?
Yeah, I love what you're asking, Susan, and I think the time is right now. The time is right because it's heightened time in terms of diversity and inclusion. And I mentioned before that companies are being scrutinized. It's not just companies, everyone is being scrutinized for their response to what's happening. So absolutely, you can lead an effort and not be a person of color. In fact, a lot of the protests that are going on, the the group is very diverse, if you will, and there are instances where it's not a person of color who is leading the protest. So just to tap onto that last question. And I think in terms of leading the effort with the school, asking the question is the first step. You've got to ask, what are you doing? Do you have a strategy for diversity and inclusion in the school? Can I see it? Can I be a part of it? If you're a part of the PTA, bringing that to the agenda, can we add this as a standing item on the agenda and talk about what the school is doing? I know in the state of Connecticut, there is some work around inclusion or more education around African Americans in the curriculum at the high school level. I want to pause and just bring Veronica into this conversation as well, because you may have some thoughts on working with schools and what they can do to foster this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key areas of opportunity for parents, and even some of you that are educators on this call, is to not be afraid to say that you care about diversity. I think that there's just a ton of ways where, you know, people have been afraid to share their opinion about issues that matter most. And I think that what's been heightened in the last 3 weeks is that equity is truly a piece that's been missing from this diversity and inclusion conversation for years, right? If we date back to the years of harm to people of color, right, to communities, for healthcare disparities, educational disparities, there's so many things that we are afraid to talk about. But when you are in a position of power, just sharing your voice, right? There's power in not being silent anymore. And I think that this is a way that you can do it, right? And this is also a way that you can help shape your children's idea of diversity, how they see themselves as being diverse, right? Kind of their identity that's tapped into that. And then also, more specifically of getting involved in your child's school, because I guarantee you, in 2 years ago, I was a substitute teacher, and it was a very, very humbling experience, because you, one, see where the true disparities lie with each of your students, kind of their areas of growth, and not every child learns the same. Not every child lives in the same type of environment. So the one size fits all is not going to work. But I would say that one thing that truly works when it comes to educating children is being open, being honest, and literally sharing the joy of reading, learning, exploring, all of the things that kind of pique their interest, because they soak everything up, right? Like, it's super easy to teach a child a second language than it is to teach someone at the age of 30 a different language, right? Research has shown that children soak up everything around them. So you reading a bedtime story to them every night is definitely going to be, you know, kind of an area where they can grow, but then also having some deep conversations with your child's teachers, right?
Mm-hmm.
No matter if they're in 3rd grade or even in preschool, if you are open as a parent and you face some form of opposition with your child's school, there's only 2 things that you can do. 1, you can keep pushing, and 2, maybe it's time for you to find a different school for your child, right? If there's, I would say my mom, she transferred me from a different school in a heartbeat if she felt as if I was being bullied, if she felt as if I wasn't learning at the speed that I need to learn. So you have ownership over your child's education, and having conversations about inclusion and diversity it can be handled in school and it can be handled at home. So you can kind of complete the picture by doing your part as a parent and of course as an educator.
Yeah, such good stuff, Veronica. Well, we're wrapping up on time. We had two more questions. I just wanted to quickly wrap it up and mention a couple things that we're showing on the screen here. Inclusionschool.com, you can find all these resources that we're mentioning today. One big ask, the way that you can support us, follow us on Instagram and Pinterest. Inclusion School, super easy to find. We post regularly. And reviews on iTunes helps others find it. As you can imagine, this is a really much needed conversation right now. People need these tools, but they can't find us unless we have reviews. So we're climbing up there. Every review counts, and you can easily search and find that on iTunes. Christine, you had asked a question about 70% Hispanic schools. I highly recommend a resource we've mentioned a few times, Teaching Tolerance for educators. There's curriculum specifically about race and ethnicity. So I think that might give you some really good ideas on how to build in racial representation, especially in a culture that might feel racist against Mexicans, like you said. So I'd recommend that one. Sorry, we don't have time to go into more depth than that, but if you go there and you don't find the resources you need, let Simone and I know. And then Candace said, what suggestions do you have on helping kids find their identity? Candace, one of the things our book authors have recommended, and those that are filling their bookshelves with diverse books, is different types of families. Instead of talking about it always as an individual identity, especially for kids that may not know their gender identity yet, they may not know their sexual orientation identity yet, rather than pushing them to decide too early, talking about different types of families, having different types of family structures and different types of characters and representation across all genders, all cultures. So I think books are really helpful there. For sexual orientation, Disney has a new short movie out called Out. It's on Disney. That's also really helpful to talk about with kiddos. So I think sometimes facilitating that rather than asking the direct question. Um, Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much. It's been great to talk with everybody. If we didn't get to one of your questions, talk to us at inclusionschool.com. Be sure to follow us on social media, and we really appreciate reviews so that others can find us. Thanks, Simone. It's always good to be with you.
You too, and thanks everybody for spending your lunch with us, and thanks to our guests for joining us. Sally, Neil, and Veronica, we so appreciate you taking extra time to join us today, and thank you for everyone that has made the time for this very important conversation.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.